Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KON, Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by our friends at the McPherson Tax Defense Group, 1-800-BEAT-IRS, beatirs.com. That's B-E-A-T, IRS, serving Alaskans, Americans since 1978 with 2 generations of tax defense attorneys. We have on the line with us Dr. John Zmirak. He's a regular contributor to this program. He also has written a number of articles that have appeared at Restoring Liberty. He's the editor for thestream.org, author of Global Economist, The Grand Inquisitor, The Race to Save Our Century. He's also a writer for the Weekly Standard, USA Today, Front Page Magazine. The American Conservative, has his B.A. from Yale University, Ph.D. from Louisiana State, and was a press secretary for pro-life governor an eon ago. We're going to talk a little bit about one of his recent articles, but we put this article up at restoringliberty.com entitled Marco Rubio, 4 More Years of George Bush, ? We took some liberties with the title that originally appeared at thestream.org under the title After Iowa, a 3-man race, Andy Jackson, Cal Coolidge, and George W. Dr. Zmirak, of course, some time has elapsed since the Iowa caucuses. We're now in the middle of New Hampshire. Tell us a little bit about your conclusions, why you wrote the article.
Yeah, well, I wanted to address the way that different candidates approached America's place in the world, how we should treat our borders, international trade, and foreign policy. 3 major issues, and the issues on which they really distinguish themselves from each other. They also take roughly similar stances on social issues, which is a good thing. Donald Trump, I think, represents a kind of reincarnation of Andrew Jackson, a sort of Scots-Irish border adventurer who sees America as unique. Each of these candidates believes in a version of American exceptionalism, but they define it differently. The Andrew Jackson, Donald Trump definition of American exceptionalism is that we're uniquely strong, uniquely wealthy, and, in a sense, exempt from the rules that bind other countries. We don't have to concern ourselves with international norms or international law or really necessarily the moral law. And there's a certain almost naked group egoism that you see in Jacksonian conservatism, Jacksonian nationalism, which is reminiscent of what you see in European nationalism. And I think some of what's being described as xenophobia among Trump supporters is really simply that kind of American nationalism. And in that way, it's similar to French nationalism, and German and Irish nationalism.
Let me just ask you just real quickly about whether or not you agree with the criticism that, does Trump worry you that he has fascist inclinations?
Yes, insofar as he doesn't seem to have any respect for the Constitution, the separation of power, the rule of law, or private property. It's all about getting things done effectively. And that focus on effectiveness, that utter pragmatism, is really kind of un-American. If you look at our founders and what they wrote about, the way they wrote, if you look at even leaders in wartime like Abraham Lincoln, they were preoccupied with the rule of law and with trying to stay within the bright lines of the Constitution. And I feel like Donald Trump does not follow in that tradition. He's more in the Huey Long and Franklin Roosevelt tradition of doing whatever it takes to get what you want accomplished and not necessarily looking at the price.
It's interesting, his support network. When you mentioned Andrew Jackson, of course, a very populist-type candidate. Of course, Andrew Jackson won the popular election, didn't get elected. I think that's how it went. And then he ran again, got elected, became president. Trump, of course, also calls on that kind of well, I'm not even going to call it grassroots, because most of these, I wouldn't say most, but a significant portion of his support base isn't stereotypically political activist. A lot of them are new players in the political system, and it's just extraordinary because it seems that no matter what he does, he can do no wrong in their eyes. You heard about, of course, what happened.
And that in itself is worrisome.
Right. Well, even he himself made the comment, I could shoot somebody in the street and my folk would still support me. And that's a paraphrase, but effectively what he said.
Yeah.
And he repeated the P word in a political gathering just recently. You heard about that, and doubled down on it during an interview. He says that, I got a standing ovation. What's wrong with that?
Right. I mean, I'll use the P word. He's reminding me a little of Vladimir Putin, and not in a good way. So the second candidate I looked at, Ted Cruz, I think is in the tradition of William Howard Taft, Calvin Coolidge, and I'd say Ronald Reagan, in that he thinks America's unique because we come from a unique political heritage, the Anglo-American heritage, which is concerned with the Christian view of man as a being that has rights to life, liberty, and protection of property, pursuit of happiness. That version of American uniqueness says that we should be very careful to stay within the bounds of the Constitution, that these rules that our founders set up for us are what has made our unique national success possible and has distinguished us from other republics that declared independence, like Mexico and Venezuela and Bolivia and Argentina, which did not have the respect for a constitutional rule of law. And I think that tradition is a very important one, and that's why I'm inclined so far to favor Ted Cruz. And in terms of foreign policy, I think Trump and Cruz have a lot in common in that they would not see the world as a place that we're going to go around reconstructing other countries in our own image. They would both look to a limited kind of realist vision of America's role in the world, that we look out for our country's interests. I think Cruz would be somewhat more principled about it. You see a different approach to torture. Donald Trump says waterboarding, and we're going to do a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding. Ted Cruz points to his father's experience of being tortured in Cuba, and he says, well, we're not going to torture. We might, in extraordinary circumstances, use waterboarding because it's not torture, but we're going to be very careful about it, again, because he's staying true to a set of abstract principles that he thinks are important that help to define America.
You notice he had problems with that, of course, answering that question in the last Republican debate. You caught that, right?
Well, I think Cruz said it. I thought what he said was clear.
No, he hesitated. That's not just me saying it. I mean, a number of pundits reflected on how that was a difficult response for him, as if maybe he was thinking about it on stage. But I think his answer is pretty consistent with what you're saying. Just wanted a quick question for you, kind of related to this whole neocon debate, whether or not Cruz and Trump are distinct from what we've traditionally seen in the Republican Party. Specifically with respect to Cruz, he recently made the comment, I think 3 weeks ago, that Snowden is a traitor, effectively. I mean, that's, again, a paraphrase. But that's a 180 from what he had said a number of months ago, where he basically championed some of the disclosures made by Snowden. Does that concern you, or do you have an explanation for it?
I was disappointed by that, but that struck me as sort of opportunistic. I think Cruz will be bound by the Constitution in the way he deals with domestic security, but I was disappointed with that. I lean more towards Rand Paul on that. But again, when we're talking about the neoconservatives, I think we're talking mostly about foreign policy. And that's where Marco Rubio stands out as being the heir of Woodrow Wilson and George W. Bush. He has a vision of American exceptionalism, which says that America has happened upon the single formula by which everyone on the face of the earth ought to be governed, whether they know it or not. If you remember George W. Bush's second inaugural address, it was like a speech by Leon Trotsky in 1917 in this level of universalism, that the American system is the thing everyone on earth is craving, whether they know it or not, and we just have to show up with our troops and our money, and pretty much any country at all that is in trouble can be fixed by being remade in the image of the United States of America. And I think we saw that with Marco Rubio's support for the fiasco in Libya, and with what he's saying now, that he'd be willing to shoot down Russian planes in order to help the Syrian rebels overthrow Bashir Assad. Now, those Libyan rebels are dominated by the al-Nusra Front, who are allied with al-Qaeda and funded by the Saudis. And there are no Christians left in the regions controlled by these Syrian rebels, whereas there are more than 1 million Christians living in peace and tolerance under Bashir Assad. So I think the whole idea that America is going to go overturn a secular Arab dictator, remake the country into a democracy, and turn it over to radical Sunni Muslims, that has a very familiar feel. That sounds exactly like the Iraq War. So I've basically said that Marco Rubio is running to serve out George W. Bush's third term.
You saw the article by Jason Scott Jones entitled "Rubio, Christie, and Bush Would Use Our Military to Prevent a Genocide of Christians in Syria," right?
Yeah, I actually helped him with it. with the
Yeah, I
research.
mean, it just it's spot on. I mean, and that's exactly what's been going on. I mean, it's just an upside-down world. I talked to a vet, this past weekend, at a gun show. He noticed my first ID hat I was wearing. I was trying to be incognito, and he happened to be from my same armor battalion, the Dreadnoughts. And he served after I was in the first Desert Storm. He served 2004, 2005, several different deployments in combat. And he was just shaking his head over what's happened in Iraq, basically saying, look, all the people we lost, all the blood, sweat, and tears, it was for naught. Now we've got this, basically this Iranian proxy in Iraq. And in addition to that, look at all the Christians that are getting slaughtered in Syria. And he made this observation. He said, at least the Russians are doing something good. And I found that, of course, very...
I agree.
Yeah, go ahead.
Terribly ironic. I mean, people don't remember, under conservative Christian President George W. Bush, more than 1 million Christians were driven out at gunpoint from their homeland of Iraq, where they had been for almost 2,000 years. They were driven out while our troops followed their orders and stood by and did nothing because they were told to do nothing. I have no reason to think that Marco Rubio's Syria would go any better than George Bush's Iraq. So, honestly, that for me is a deal killer. I don't favor Donald Trump, but I think he'd be a less dangerous choice for America than Marco Rubio or any of the other so-called establishment candidates, Christie, Kasich, and Bush, all of whom seem to be captives of the neoconservative establishment in Washington. And I think Donald Trump and Ted Cruz have both shown courage in standing up to that establishment, which is one reason that the establishment is terrified of them.
We'll talk more with Dr. John Zmirak right after these messages. The Joe Miller Show will be right back.